When the blizzard trapped him inside his cabin, one man's ingenuity would prove to be the difference between survival and death. Amidst the howl of the wind and the relentless snow, a hidden hatch beneath the floor would reveal its true worth in a life-or-death struggle against nature itself. Before we dive into the harrowing tale, let us know where you're watching from. If you're moved by stories of survival in the wild, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode promises even more heart-pounding moments you won't want to miss. The world outside had turned into a swirling mass of white. Snow, thick and unyielding, battered the small log cabin nestled in the remote wilderness. Samuel Hawkins stood at the window, his broad shoulders hunched against the frigid air that seeped through the cracks in the logs. The wind screamed through the trees, its shrill cry seeming almost human in its desperation. His breath fogged the glass as he watched the storm intensify, swirling snow in every direction. It had been a quiet winter, too quiet, but now the storm had escalated in a way that felt dangerous. Samuel knew the mountain passes well. He had lived on the frontier long enough to understand how the weather could turn at a moment's notice. This was no ordinary blizzard. It was a relentless force that threatened to bury everything in its path. The storm had arrived with such speed that even seasoned trappers in the area were caught off guard. For a moment, he wondered if the old cabin would hold, its creaking timbers protesting against the weight of the snow piling on the roof. He turned from the window, glancing over the meager supplies he had left. It wouldn't be enough if the storm kept up for much longer. The fire crackled in the hearth, a small comfort against the biting cold that seemed to grow more insistent with each passing hour. Samuel knew he had only one option left. He had to ride it out. He adjusted his thick woolen coat, the heavy fabric worn thin from years of use. His boots, hardened by mud and snow, were heavy with the weight of winter's toll. In the corner of the cabin, a small trapdoor lay beneath the floorboards. Samuel knelt down, his rough hands brushing away the dust and snow that had settled on the hatch. It was a hidden space, one he had built out of necessity years ago, but it had become more of an afterthought over time. He had never really expected to use it, but with the storm raging outside, the hatch might be the only thing that could save him. The cold had come early that year, and with it the danger of being trapped. Samuel had always known that the wilderness could be unforgiving, but it wasn't just the elements that posed a threat. It was the isolation. In a storm like this, no one would be able to reach him. He had to depend on his own skills and resourcefulness. He lifted the hatch, feeling the weight of the floorboards shift beneath him. It was cramped down there, a small space that had once served as a hidden storage area for supplies and extra pelts. But now it would be his refuge. The storm outside had already begun to shake the cabin as the wind howled louder, and the heavy snow began to creep in around the edges of the doorframe. Samuel's mind raced, but his hands moved with practiced calm. He closed the hatch behind him, retreating into the safety of the secret space as the blizzard raged on outside. Hours passed in the darkness of the hidden space beneath the cabin. Samuel had long since abandoned any hope of hearing the storm's end. The wind howled like an animal caught in a trap, and the cabin's walls groaned under the weight of the snow. From his makeshift refuge, Samuel could hear the sound of the world outside crashing against his home. He gripped the edge of the floor hatch, bracing himself against the shaking structure. A deep, foreboding silence filled the cabin now. The storm had reached its peak, and Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before the snow began to pile high enough to breach the door. He had prepared for this, but even so, the feeling of isolation gnawed at him. This wasn't a regular storm. It was a full-on blizzard, one that could bury him alive in his cabin if the snow continued to fall unchecked. Samuel pulled his coat tighter around himself and settled against the cold earth beneath the floor. His breath was steady but shallow as he listened. The storm outside grew more intense, sending torrents of wind and snow through the cabin's old wooden beams. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, shutting out the chaos as best as he could. His mind wandered back to the moment when he had first built the hatch, a small, desperate hope he had carried with him. For years he had never imagined it would become his lifeline. But now it felt as if the blizzard outside was testing him, pushing him to the brink of his endurance. His stomach growled with hunger, and the cold that seeped through the cabin's thick walls gnawed at him relentlessly. He had enough food for a few more days, but it wouldn't last forever. He had to wait for the storm to break or find a way out. Either way, it was a race against time. The thought of the hatch gave him a sense of calm. He knew that no matter what happened outside, he would survive. He had always trusted in his ability to adapt, to learn from each challenge that came his way. The hatch wasn't just a physical space, it was a symbol of his will to survive. With it, Samuel could endure whatever the storm threw at him. As he lay there in the darkness, the blizzard outside grew even fiercer. The howling wind screamed through the cabin's walls, rattling the fragile timber like an angry beast. Samuel's hand rested on the edge of the hatch, his fingers feeling the grain of the wood. He could only wait, knowing that he had prepared for this moment, and he would survive. The night stretched on in agonizing silence, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of the wind against the cabin. Samuel's fingers, stiff from the cold, gripped the edges of the hatch beneath him. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, the chill in the air making it harder to focus. The storm outside was relentless, its fury showing no sign of relenting. He had known storms in his years of living on the frontier, but this one felt different, more insidious, more determined. He had always trusted his instincts, but now, beneath the weight of the storm, doubts crept in. The blizzard had continued its assault without pause, and the howling wind had begun to sound like the shriek of a wild animal. The cabin creaked and groaned as though it were fighting back against the battering forces of nature. Yet Samuel knew there was nothing he could do but wait. The hatch offered him some sense of protection, but it didn't shield him from the creeping fear that gnawed at his insides. He could feel the cold seeping deeper into his bones. It wasn't just the chill of the winter, it was the weight of isolation, of being trapped in a place where the world outside had become an unknowable, hostile force. Samuel thought of the other trappers he had met over the years, tough men who had braved the wilderness alongside him. Yet even they wouldn't stand a chance in this storm. He had once heard tales of men who had been caught in blizzards and never returned. The snow would bury them, erasing all signs of their existence. He couldn't allow that to happen to him. Not here, not now. Samuel clenched his teeth and pushed the thought away. Survival wasn't just about brute force or luck. It was about persistence, about enduring the trials that the wilderness imposed on those brave enough to challenge it. The minutes bled into hours, and still, the storm raged outside. The small fire in the cabin's hearth had dwindled to little more than embers. Samuel knew he could not afford to let it die completely. He shifted on the cold floor and crawled toward the trap door, the muscles in his legs protesting as he moved. He opened the hatch and reached up to gather some firewood, careful not to let the cold air from the cabin's interior seep into his refuge. When he rose back to his makeshift bed beneath the floorboards, the storm had intensified further. The howling wind had become deafening, and the snow piled up quickly against the door. Samuel's hands trembled as he stoked the fire, forcing himself to stay focused. His provisions were limited, and though he had enough to get by for a few more days, his thoughts kept turning to escape. If the storm didn't break, his cabin would soon be buried, and with it, any hope of survival. The storm had passed its second day with no sign of letting up. Snow had piled up to the point where Samuel could no longer see the door of the cabin through the small window. His heart had hardened as he considered the bleak reality of his situation. He was trapped in his cabin with no way to escape the snow and no one to help him. The world outside had become a frozen wilderness, an unforgiving force that cared little for his plight. Still, Samuel wasn't ready to give in to fear. His time on the frontier had taught him the value of patience and resourcefulness. Survival was never about the strength of one's body alone. It was about the ability to outlast the challenges nature threw your way. For now, he could do little but wait. But that didn't mean he wasn't thinking ahead. The hatch beneath him had become his lifeline, a secret haven where he could take refuge when the storm made it impossible to stay in the main cabin. As the days dragged on, he found himself retreating there more often, the space growing more familiar and comforting. In the darkness, with only the faint glow of the embers to light his way, Samuel began to appreciate the simple ingenuity that had led him to construct the hidden hatch years ago. It wasn't just a storage space, it was a sanctuary. On the third day of the storm, Samuel's mind began to wander back to the time when he had first come to this isolated spot. He had been driven by a need to escape, to find a place where he could live on his own terms, far from the civilization he had grown tired of. The wilderness had been both a challenge and a reward, offering him the solitude he craved, but also testing his limits. Now, in the grip of the storm, the wilderness was threatening to reclaim everything he had built. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life on the frontier. But then, a faint sound cut through the chaos outside, a muffled thud, then another, faint but distinct. Samuel paused, his heart leaping in his chest. For a brief moment, he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, but the sound came again, louder this time. A series of knocks, deliberate, rhythmic. It was coming from the direction of the door. His breath caught in his throat. Could it be someone out there? Another trapper? A rescue party? He knew it was possible, but in his isolation, hope had become a rare and fragile thing. As quickly as the thought had come, doubt followed. Could he really expect help this far out in the wilderness, especially in the midst of such a blizzard? But the knocks continued, steady and insistent, each one louder than the last. Samuel hesitated, torn between caution and the flicker of hope that had ignited in him. Was someone there, or was it the storm playing tricks on his mind? With trembling hands, he pulled the hatch open once more, preparing to emerge from his refuge. The answer to his question would soon be clear. The knocks on the door grew louder, each one a pulse that resonated in Samuel's chest. He froze, unsure if he was imagining it. The storm had done strange things to his mind, playing tricks on him in his isolation. But no, this was no illusion. There was someone out there, knocking on his door in the middle of the blizzard. Samuel's instincts told him to stay hidden, to remain in his refuge below the cabin. It was safer there. And if the storm was truly as bad as he thought, anyone trying to brave it outside would be a fool. But then, the thought of being alone in this wild place for another week, maybe longer, pushed him out of his hesitation. The knocks weren't just a random sound, they were deliberate. They were asking for something. He crawled up from the safety of the hatch, the cold air of the cabin wrapping around him like a harsh reminder of the world outside. He could see his breath misting in the dim light as he moved toward the door. Each step felt like an eternity as he approached the threshold, heart pounding in his chest. The wind had shifted, now howling even louder than before, as if the storm itself were warning him not to open the door. Samuel grasped the cold handle of the door, feeling the weight of it in his hand. The house groaned in protest, the logs shifting under the pressure of the snow that had piled up against them. There was no mistaking it. The weather was relentless. But this visitor, this knock on his door, was too much of a sign for him to ignore. With a deep breath, Samuel yanked the door open, the wind pushing back with all its force. It howled through the small gap, pushing against his shoulders and forcing him to brace himself. And then, standing in the doorway, he saw the figure. A man. Bent low against the storm, his body hunched against the cold, a thick salt and pepper beard framed his face, and his eyes, though tired, were filled with determination. He wore a coat much like Samuel's, threadbare and covered in snow. His hands were numb, gripping the doorframe for support as he leaned heavily on the cabin's entrance. Samuel's mind raced. Another prospector, no doubt, someone who had been caught by the storm just as he had. But the man's presence here, at this exact moment, felt like fate itself had delivered him to Samuel's door. "Help!" the man rasped, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Please, I need to get out of this storm." Samuel hesitated, glancing quickly over his shoulder into the warmth of the cabin. The fire was still going, though weak, and the food supply was running low. He wasn't sure how much longer he could endure, but the thought of leaving someone out there in the freezing snow was unbearable. Without another word, he stepped aside, pulling the door open wider to let the man in. As the stranger stumbled inside, Samuel helped him to the fire, guiding him to a chair by the hearth. The man collapsed into it, shivering violently, his teeth chattering. Samuel went to work quickly, fetching extra blankets from the storage shelf and stoking the fire to bring some warmth back into the cabin. For a long moment neither man spoke. The storm outside raged with renewed fury, but inside, the warmth of the fire began to work its magic. Samuel watched the stranger carefully, noting the worn, weathered look on his face. This was no ordinary traveler. This was a man who had lived through storms like this before. Eventually, the man spoke again, his voice hoarse, but stronger, now that the warmth was beginning to take hold. "I thought I was done for," he muttered, staring into the fire. "The storm, it came out of nowhere. I've been wandering for hours trying to find shelter." Samuel nodded, taking a seat across from him. "You're safe now. The storm doesn't look like it'll let up soon." The stranger glanced up, his eyes wide with a mix of gratitude and awe. "I didn't think anyone else lived this far out." Samuel gave a faint smile, his own mind drifting back to the isolation he had chosen when he first came to these mountains. "Not many do. I've been here a long time, but we'll make it through." As the stranger settled by the fire, the storm outside raged with increasing intensity. Snow now swirled in torrents, piling high against the windows and door, obscuring the world beyond. Samuel couldn't help but feel a weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't just the warmth of the fire or the company of another soul. It was the fact that, for the first time in days, he didn't feel so alone. But the presence of the stranger also stirred something deeper in Samuel, a reminder of how fragile survival could be. The wilderness, no matter how familiar, always held the threat of sudden, unrelenting violence. The storm outside was a brutal reminder that life on the frontier could change in an instant. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and a man could be lost forever to the wilds. Samuel settled into the chair across from the fire, watching as the stranger gratefully accepted the warmth. The man was older than Samuel had initially guessed. His hair was graying at the temples, his face drawn with the hard lines of a life lived on the edge of survival. But there was a glint of something in his eyes, something that told Samuel he wasn't the kind of man to be easily broken by nature's fury. As the fire crackled, Samuel poured a mug of weak coffee from the pot on the stove, offering it to the stranger. The man took it, with a quiet nod of thanks. "I thought I was done for out there," the stranger murmured again, his voice steady but tinged with the raw edge of fear. "I've been through my share of storms, but this one, I couldn't make it through. I'd lost track of how far I'd gone." Samuel took a sip of his own coffee, watching the man carefully. The stranger wasn't just looking for warmth or shelter. He was looking for reassurance. But the price of survival out here was never that simple. It was a constant balance between risk and caution, between trusting the land and respecting its power. "It's easy to lose track of time in a storm like this," Samuel said, his voice low. "I've been caught out in the wilderness before. But you learn to listen to the storm, to the land, and when it's time to find shelter, you don't hesitate." The man nodded, his gaze distant as if lost in his thoughts. Samuel could see the weariness in his face, the exhaustion that only the wilderness could bring. "I don't know how you've managed out here for so long, but I know this. If you hadn't opened that door, I wouldn't be here right now. The weight of the stranger's words hung heavy in the room. Samuel looked at him for a long moment, his mind weighing the truth in the man's gratitude. Survival was never about one man, it was about the balance of nature and man, and how well you adapted to it. Samuel had built his life on that understanding, and though he was glad to help, he knew better than to think that survival could be owed to kindness alone. "You'll be fine now," Samuel said, his voice firm yet compassionate. "But out here, it's never just about luck. You have to be prepared to face whatever comes." The stranger looked at him, his eyes widening with understanding. "I see that now," he said quietly, the firelight flickering in his gaze. And as the storm continued to rage outside, the two men settled into an unspoken understanding. Survival was about more than just endurance. It was about knowing when to trust in your instincts and when to rely on the rare chance of finding another soul in the wilderness. The wind howled with a force that seemed intent on ripping the cabin from its foundation. Samuel sat by the fire, his thoughts wandering as the stranger slept fitfully in the corner. The storm outside continued its assault, with snow now blurring the boundary between the world and the cabin. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a fragile thread, but it was enough to keep the cold at bay, for now. Samuel watched the stranger, who was wrapped tightly in a blanket, his face drawn in exhaustion. The man had been through a lot in the past few days, lost in the storm with no real shelter, struggling to stay alive against the overwhelming forces of nature. Samuel understood that kind of desperation all too well. It was the very reason he had built his cabin, reinforced it, hidden his escape hatch. Survival, at its core, wasn't about hope. It was about preparation. And in this wild place, the difference between the two was as thin as the air that clung to the snow-covered peaks. For a moment, Samuel's thoughts drifted back to his own early days in the mountains, when the wilderness was a constant threat, and every decision could mean life or death. He had come here looking for solitude, for peace after a life of struggle in the East. But solitude came with its own cost. The isolation of the mountains could break a man if he wasn't careful, if he wasn't constantly aware of the dangers that lurked both in the elements and in his own mind. Samuel had learned quickly that in the wild, even the strongest men could break under the weight of silence and loneliness. It was easy to become lost in your own thoughts, to fall into a spiral of doubt. But survival, true survival, required something more. It required resilience, resourcefulness, and at times the rare gift of human connection. He turned to look at the stranger again. The man was still, his breath shallow. Samuel could see the strain on his face, the telltale signs of a man who had been pushed too far. He was lucky, Samuel thought, to have found shelter here, and yet luck alone wouldn't be enough to see him through this storm. The wilderness did not give second chances. The night passed slowly. Outside, the storm continued its fury. But inside, Samuel felt something unexpected, a strange sense of companionship. He hadn't expected to find anyone this deep in the mountains, and yet here was this stranger, brought to his door by the blizzard. The odds seemed impossible, but fate had intervened, and as much as Samuel valued his solitude, a part of him couldn't help but be grateful for the presence of another person. The fire flickered and crackled in the hearth as the minutes stretched into hours. Samuel sat quietly, his mind lost in the rhythm of the storm. He could feel the weight of the wilderness pressing down on them, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite so alone. Maybe survival wasn't just about enduring. Maybe it was about learning to rely on others when the time came. The morning light filtered through the thick curtain of snow outside, casting a pale glow on the interior of the cabin. Samuel awoke to the steady sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the logs, but the storm had softened somewhat. The ferocity had waned, replaced by the muffled, relentless drone of the snowflakes settling around the cabin. The world outside had become a vast, white wasteland, still cold and unyielding. The stranger, still wrapped in the blankets, shifted slightly but did not wake. Samuel stood, his muscles stiff from the night spent hunched in a chair. He stretched carefully, trying to shake off the lingering fatigue. The warmth from the fire had helped, but he knew they couldn't stay hidden in the cabin forever. The storm might have weakened, but it wasn't over yet. If they wanted to survive, they had to leave before the snow piled too high. He moved to the window, wiping away the frost to peer outside. The world beyond was almost unrecognizable. Everything had been covered in a thick, icy blanket. The trees were bent low beneath the weight of the snow, and the path that led from his cabin was completely obscured. The wind had formed drifts that reached up to the doorframe, and Samuel knew it would take hours, maybe longer, to clear a path. The quiet after the storm was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past days. The cabin, once a small island of warmth in the middle of a raging wilderness, now felt like a fragile bubble, suspended in time. But time was slipping away. He needed to move, to make sure the cabin didn't become their tomb. Samuel turned back to the fire, adding a few more logs to ensure the warmth would last. He approached the stranger, who was still sleeping. The man's breath came steadily now, though he had clearly been through a rough ordeal. Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for him, despite the brief time they had known each other. The wilderness was an unforgiving place, and it was no place for the weak. With a final glance at the door, Samuel knelt down beside the stranger. "Hey, you awake?" he asked softly, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. The stranger stirred, but didn't open his eyes. "Storm's past," Samuel said, louder this time, "but we need to move. We'll never get out of here if we wait any longer." The stranger groaned, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, he didn't seem to understand where he was. His gaze darted around the cabin before landing on Samuel. There was confusion in his eyes, but also a flicker of realization. He sat up slowly, wincing as his stiff body protested the movement. "Did we make it?" the man asked hoarsely, his voice rough from days in the cold. Samuel gave a nod, helping the man to his feet. "We're alive. That's something." As the stranger stood, he looked toward the door. The weight of the storm outside loomed large, but Samuel could see the resolve in his face. The worst of the storm had passed, but the wilderness was still a dangerous place. They were not out of the woods yet. They had a choice to make: stay in the safety of the cabin, or brave the storm's aftermath and push forward into the unknown. Samuel's mind was made up. The cabin could only offer temporary refuge. The true test of survival had yet to come. "We can wait here, or we can try to make it to higher ground," Samuel said, looking out the window toward the distant ridge. "But we need to move now." The stranger nodded, determination slowly replacing the exhaustion in his eyes. "Lead the way." And so, with the storm's fury subsiding and the promise of the unknown ahead, the two men stepped into the wild once more, their fate uncertain, but their resolve stronger than ever. The snow had slowed, but the wilderness was still a harsh, unforgiving place. Samuel led the stranger through the deep drifts, each step heavy with the weight of the storm's aftermath. The air was thin, biting cold, and the snow underfoot was unstable, threatening to collapse with every footfall. But Samuel's pace was steady. He had been here before, navigating the rugged terrain and understanding the language of the mountains. The stranger, though, was struggling, his movement slow and labored. "I don't know how you do this," the stranger muttered between breaths, his voice raw from the cold. Samuel didn't answer right away, focusing on the path ahead. His mind was clear, but his body was starting to tire. Even the most experienced frontiersman couldn't fight against exhaustion forever. "We'll stop soon," Samuel said, his tone firm. "We need higher ground." They reached a small ridge after what felt like hours, the wind whipping around them in sharp gusts. Samuel glanced back to check on the stranger. His face was flushed with exertion, his breath coming in gasps. Samuel felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't expected the journey to be this difficult for the man, but the storm had taken its toll on both of them. "Hang on," Samuel urged. "We'll make it. Just a little farther." As they crested the ridge, the land opened up before them, a new stretch of wilderness, seemingly untouched by the storm's fury. For the first time in days, Samuel allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. They had made it through the worst. The morning sun pierced the clouds, casting a soft golden light across the snow-covered landscape. Samuel and the stranger stood on the ridge, looking out over the wilderness that stretched endlessly before them. It was a view Samuel had come to cherish, despite all its dangers. The storm had left its mark on everything. The snow piled high, trees bent low, the land stripped of any warmth. But there was beauty in it too, the kind of beauty that only those who survived the harshest of conditions could truly appreciate. Samuel turned to the stranger, whose face was still drawn from exhaustion, but now showed the faintest trace of relief. They had made it. The journey had been grueling, but they had pushed through side by side. "Thank you," the stranger said, his voice quieter now, tinged with something more profound than gratitude. "I wouldn't have made it without you." Samuel nodded, offering a small smile. Survival's about more than just getting by. It's about knowing when to help someone else. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun rise higher into the sky. The storm was behind them now. And though the wilderness remained a harsh and dangerous place, Samuel knew they had earned this small victory. Together, they would face whatever the mountains had in store.